There are two words that, in the minds of many, almost define the JRPG genre. Final Fantasy. With 15 numbered entries and a near countless range of spin-off titles, the series has sold 150 million units and grossed over $20 billion. With a history spanning over 30 years, giving the series a similar vintage to Metal Gear and Mega Man, the series has certainly had time to evolve. In 2020, the series is known for its graphical fidelity, story depth, and iconic characters. But it wasn't always this way. So how has the series changed through the years? And given the quantity of games out there, is every entry worth your precious time? These are the questions that I'll try to answer as I play through the Final Fantasy series from the top. Our story begins in 1987, when Final Fantasy was first released in Japan for Nintendo's Famicom, making its way to the USA and the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1990. The game would see a number of Japan-only re-releases across the next decade, with a few upgrades to the graphics or sound each release. It would take 13 years for the West to see an updated version. In 2002, Final Fantasy Origins, a remake combo pack of the first two titles, arrived on the PlayStation, with a worldwide release in 2003, marking the first official appearance of both games in European territories. This version featured vastly improved graphics, a fully remixed soundtrack, a fresh translation, and more contentiously, an easy mode. In addition, a number of quality of life improvements were made, and a large number of bugs were fixed. A year later, in 2004, Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls was released for the Game Boy Advance, despite the name being almost perfect for Nintendo's next handheld. This version had a minor step down in graphics and audio due to limitations of the GBA. This version had only one difficulty that was based on the PS1 Easy mode, the magic system was reworked, many items were added, and the save system was relaxed. All of these changes served to make the game even easier. In an attempt to counteract this, enemies and bosses have an increased HP pool, and perhaps the most defining feature of this version was added. The Soul of Chaos is a series of 4 optional dungeons featuring new monsters and new-ish bosses, providing an additional challenge. Jumping forward a few more years to 2007, the PSP got its own release. This version had the last round of graphical updates and took the Origins soundtrack, but was in almost all other respects identical to the GBA release, except for the addition of one last dungeon, the Labyrinth of Time. This release is considered by some to be the definitive version of the game, as future releases for smartphones are downgrades in various ways. The iOS version loses the quality of the PSP soundtrack and introduces some minor bugs. On top of this, the Android version has managed to lose all of the bonus dungeons and even included some game-breaking bugs on certain versions of Android. Personally, I played through the full game on the PSP for the most up-to-date experience, while sampling the NES, PS1 and GBA versions. Let's begin our dive into Final Fantasy with the thing that sets games apart from other media, the gameplay. The premise of Final Fantasy is fairly simple. You travel the overworld, occasionally engaging in turn-based battles. You visit towns where you can talk to the locals and spend your hard-earned gil on equipment and items to use in turn-based battles. And you explore dungeons where you must frequently fight monsters and often bosses in turn-based battles. The vast majority of this game is turn-based battles, so let's take a look at the battle system of Final Fantasy. Upon entering a battle, you immediately see the combatants. Your party is lined up on the right, while up to 9 enemy monsters are arrayed on the left side of the screen. The enemy formation is randomly selected from a table specific to each area or dungeon floor. Recoloured sprites and different names indicate variations of enemies that are stronger and may have alternative elemental affinities or different ability lists. With the battle lines assembled, it is time to choose an action for each of your characters. Most of them work like you would expect if you'd played any RPG in the last 20 years. Attack or fight is a straightforward physical attack using the equipped weapon or the character's bare hands against the targeted enemy. In the NES version, this is important, as anything targeting an enemy that has been, as the NES version brutally calls it, terminated, will not automatically retarget to a different monster. While this does force the player to act more strategically, it can make grinding even more of a chore, as you can't just button mash through weak formations. Among the quality of life improvements in the PS1 version was the option to turn auto-targeting on, an option that became, more controversially, mandatory with Dawn of Souls and subsequent releases. Magic allows you to select a spell to cast. However, access to spells depends on character class, level, and your wallet. We'll discuss magic in more depth later, as changes that occurred between 2003 and 2004 were far more fundamental than just auto-targeting. It should be noted that many spells in the NES version are bugged, and either don't work or have an opposite effect to their intended use. Flee and run let you attempt to escape from battle. This obviously fails against bosses, and there are some enemy formations that can't be escaped. Generally, it revolves around luck and other factors. Defend was introduced in the PSP version. This makes your character defend for a turn, reducing damage taken and burning a turn without having any other effects if you're setting up for something specific. Equip was present by the release of Origins, and allows you to change your character's equipment mid-battle. In my experience, this has fairly limited utility. While enemies are classified into types and have elemental affinities, the range of weaponry is too shallow to really take advantage of weaknesses, and generally dungeons have only 1 or 2 enemy types that have a particular weakness. You can usually set your equipment pre-dungeon and be fine. An additional factor on the NES version is that many weapons that supposedly have elemental effects are actually bugged and are just completely normal. Drink and item is actually slightly more complicated than one would expect, and is one of the big differences in the NES version. Potions and antidotes are used with the drink action, while item is used for activating equipment in that character's inventory that can cast certain spells. However, these were merged by the PS1 version, working much more like modern systems. Interestingly, the updated equipment system means that casting items that are equipped on a character can't actually be used for casting. So, you've selected your actions. What about the monsters you are fighting? Enemy actions are semi-random, with the game randomly selecting to use a spell, a skill, or a regular attack. The actual spell or skill used, however, is simply read in order from a predefined list. This can give the player an advantage if they know the lists, but outside the incredibly precise world of tool-assisted speedrunning, the player won't know for sure what is going to happen next. Turn order is similarly semi-random. Once all actions have been selected, a list is created featuring 9 enemy slots and the 4 player slots. Even if there are fewer combatants, the list is created in the same way. The missing combatants are simply skipped on resolution. 2 random numbers are then selected, and the occupants of those positions are switched. This is repeated 17 times, then the final list is acted out. This does provide a slight advantage to the enemies, so a wise player never banks on going first, especially if all 9 enemy slots are populated. I have seen many reports that agility has an effect on turn order, however I was unable to find any actual algorithms or formula that support this during my research, so I'll simply leave it at that and move on to what is known about stats. Characters have 5 main stats: strength, agility, intelligence, stamina, also known as vitality or endurance, and luck. These stats will be raised as your character levels up, but more on that later. There are also 4 other stats that may rely upon the main stats and the equipment of the character: attack, accuracy, defense, and evasion. Given the number of versions and the lack of proven information, I'll give a brief overview of the most common understandings of these stats. Many of them are pretty obvious. Strength affects attack. Agility affects evasion and possibly accuracy, though sources conflict. Intelligence is supposed to affect spell damage, however pre-Dawn of Souls it is again bugged and does literally nothing. Stamina is linked to HP gained per level in some versions, and supposedly the growth rate of your other stats in different versions. Again, I couldn't find any proof for the latter, but it is a common claim. This is perhaps the hardest one to nail down precisely, as levelling up is partially random, as we will discuss shortly. Luck is self-explanatory. It improves your luck very marginally, and can generally be ignored by all accounts. Attack, as I mentioned, is related to strength, but also takes into consideration the attack rating of the currently equipped weapon. Attack is the value used in damage calculations. Accuracy or hit rate on the NES may be affected by agility, or may be its own semi-hidden stat that is combined with the accuracy rating of the current weapon. As the name suggests, it determines if an attack hits, but may also affect the number of times you hit. Hits cap out at 8 naturally, but can be increased with certain spells. Defense reduces the damage taken in such a straightforward manner that its NES name was Absorb. It seems to be based purely upon the equipped armour for most classes. Evasion makes you harder to hit. Agility is its main source stat, with armour weight playing a role. There is also a hidden magic defense stat that helps determine if a spell hit your character and how much damage it does. Armour may or may not have some influence on magic defense. The next stat to mention is HP. Its function is obvious, but I'll say it for completion's sake. HP is a measure of how much damage you take before being knocked out. And our final stat is MP, in Dawn of Souls onwards. This is the modern system that most RPGs, especially a majority of the Final Fantasy series, uses. A single pool, which is decreased by a spell's MP cost when you cast that spell. But what about in Origins and earlier? Here, things are very different and involve quite a splattering of numbers. To break it down, spells are separated into levels 1 through 8. And rather than having individual casting costs, you get a certain number of charges for each magic level. As your magic users grow in level, they will earn additional charges, but charges do cap out at 9 per level. This system is very different to the MP system, requiring the player to think differently about how they use spells, especially given the lack of ways to replenish these charges within dungeons. It makes spellcasters much harder to use early in the game, where you only have a couple of charges available for long journeys or your first dungeons. Who are these spellcasters? I guess it's time to introduce our cast of characters, a fairly loose term in this game, the Warriors of Light. When you start the game, you are prompted to form your group of 4 yet-to-be-named warriors. There are 6 classes to choose from, and each class has an upgraded version that becomes available around midway through the game. You can select your 4 Warriors of Light as any combination, including multiples of the following. The Fighter or Warrior is a cross between a Barbarian and a tank. This guy gets access to the heaviest weapons, heaviest armours, and has a stat focus on strength, HP and agility. He hits hard and shrugs it off when he gets hit back. A solid combatant through most of the game, the one downside is the cost of his equipment. Multiple warriors will cost quite the chunk of change to outfit. The upgraded version is the Knight, who gains access to low-level white magic. The Thief, who never actually does any stealing in this game, is our next class. With a focus on agility and luck with only a side order of strength, a Thief might not hit as hard as the warrior, but his speed often gives him enough extra hits to keep pace as a damage dealer. Once upgraded to a ninja, you may equip some of the stronger weapons that had been exclusive to the warrior initially, and he gains access to the first 4 levels of black magic. Our final physical class is the Monk, also known as the Black Belt. A fragile fist fighter, the Monk works differently to other classes, gaining bonuses for going into battles unarmed. The Monk focuses on stamina, with everything else a bit more balanced. The lack of highly defensive equipment is a danger, and magic can hit them very hard. Upgrading to the Master will provide an improved unarmed bonus in later installments. In the NES and Origins versions, upgrading to a Master is actually detrimental, as it reduces future magic defense growth. They are the only class that gets access to no magic throughout the game. On the mystical side, we have our follower of the school of white magic, the White Mage. Healing and support is her trade, with stat focuses on intelligence and HP. Very limited on the defensive front due to fewer choices in equipment, the White Mage isn't up to much when it comes to offences either. She carves out a niche as a slayer of the undead, but can't hit anything else until upgrading to the White Wizard and learning the highest level of white magic. Which doesn't matter a great deal, as much of her time will be spent being the team's medic anyway. The counterpart and opposite number to the White Mage is the Black Mage. Despite a bit of a shy streak, this is the guy you turn to when you want to unleash primal elements on hapless monsters. Intelligence and agility are the Black Mage's main stats. He trades off HP for a bit more evasion, and a lot more utility in the spell department. With fire, ice and lightning at his disposal, plus some of the more offensive support moves, the Black Mage can certainly be an asset. The 2nd and 3rd grade elemental spells hit all enemies on the field, very useful when you're up against a screen full of enemies. They upgrade into the Black Wizard, giving them a couple more equipment options and access to the most destructive black magic spells. Finally, we have the ultimate fence sitter. Ostensibly a spellcaster, the Red Mage is really a true jack of all trades. With balanced stats, access to plenty of equipment, and also access to some magic from both schools, the Red Mage can be a decent understudy to most of the other classes. They do get the short end of the HP stick, and can't quite reach the smashing potential of the Knight or the magical heights of either class of mage, but being able to slash one goblin with a sword, then set another on fire a turn later, is worth something. The upgrade to Red Wizard opens up a couple more levels of black and white magic, though some spells are still restricted to the masters of the respective schools. You may have noticed talk of stat focuses, but what does this actually mean, and how do the characters grow into their focused stats? By levelling up, of course. Whenever an enemy formation is defeated, the surviving members of the party all gain experience points. After earning enough experience, they gain a level. This is where that contentious easy mode makes itself known, as one main effect of easy mode is to reduce the amount of XP to level up, while doubling the level cap. so you level up more often and increase your stats even further by the end of the game. So now it's time to explain the stat growth. Every time a character gains a level, they are guaranteed to gain at least some HP, and magic users will gain MP or spell charges. Then it gets complicated. For each level, each class has preset stats that get a boost. Often these will be the class's stat focuses, but not always. However, every other stat also has a chance of increasing. HP and MP are included in this, and when boosted as a preset or random chance, the character will gain considerably more HP or MP than normal. This results in some variation between characters, even those of the same class, which is generally a good thing. However, a string of bad luck can lead some characters to feeling woefully underpowered or far more fragile than others, while good luck can do the opposite. In general though, it tends to balance out across the span of the game, and gives a slight bit more replay value than just party composition. So, does the combat system hold up in the modern era? In my opinion it does, but only barely. Battles on the NES are slow to the point that it too often falls into the realm of frustration, especially when grinding is much more necessary in that version. Later versions improve on this, but it remains a point against the original release. In many ways there is a lack of depth to the gameplay. Too often the game uses randomness awkwardly, which dilutes strategic aspects. The selection of equipment is too shallow, often resulting in no actual choices. You simply pick whichever has the highest number. Elemental attributes are underused, even when they work, compounding the equipment issue. It isn't all bad though. The character classes are mostly distinct, with the thief being the only one that really lacks a proper niche, and with 40 plus spells there are plenty of options on the magic front. When it works. The huge amount of bugs in the NES version do hamstring its gameplay. The fact that some of those bugs weren't fixed until the Dawn of Souls release doesn't help the PlayStation version either. The added strategic layer of the spell charge system is certainly an interesting experience, though it can be a little too limited in the late game dungeons. On the other hand, the forced easy mode of later versions serves to make the combat often too simple. For much of the game you can just mash the button for attack, only needing to sling spells on rare occasions. With zero dedicated grinding, my party was able to walk through most of the game with only a couple of characters getting knocked out. I was fully exploring each dungeon for treasures and defeating most enemy formations on the way, so you could try and retain some challenge if you imposed some personal rules. The bosses did get a slight rework, so they can still knock you all down if you are unprepared, and the bonus dungeons provide something for true challenge seekers. But the later releases do deserve their easy reputation. Despite some glaring problems, if you squint there is a solid foundation here. It may not rate highly today, but it is easy to see why it captivated many in its own time, and why the systems that grew from this point endured for so long. We've looked at how you fight in Final Fantasy. Next up, where do you do the fighting? The world of Final Fantasy I is never given a proper name, though it is often referred to as World A due to one of the spin-offs that we won't be getting into here. With 3 main continents to explore and a number of islands, it's a wide world filled with forests, marshland, deserts and uncrossable mountains. Towns and dungeons are scattered across the land, and most of your time between dungeons is spent figuring out how to get to the next one. At the start of the game, your party travels on foot, but as you progress through the game you will gradually unlock a few modes of transport. The ship allows you to sail the seas, but landing points are limited to ports and river openings, which are only present on the first but largest continent. You can only traverse rivers and lakes with the canoe, which sounds nice but feels underused, and the major river section is more of a maze. Your final mode of transport is the airship. This boat with big ass turbines lets you fly across the whole world over seas and mountaintops, giving you access to the other 2 continents and all their towns and dungeons. There is one slight caveat. Like the regular ocean-faring ship and its ports, the airship has a restriction on where it can land. Those forests, marshlands, deserts and mountains are all off limits to the landing gear of the airship. You can only land on the few patches of clear grassland, often resulting in long walks to get to anywhere interesting. I can understand this from a design perspective. You want to keep your players engaged with battles and exploration. Letting the airship land just anywhere would let them zip back and forth between towns and dungeons, and potentially skip over chunks of content. My main gripe is how this is put into practice on the overworld. It's tough to know which patches of clear grass are actually big enough to land on without testing it, and worse, the airship will go all the way down to the ground before deciding if it is actually capable of landing. It may have been simpler just to have something like the seaports to designate landing zones, rather than trying to continue a facade of freedom. It is a minor complaint, and it's the biggest one I have with the overworld's design. I do like the way that transport options act as a form of soft gatekeeping, preventing you from going to later areas with more dangerous foes without breaking the immersion. On the whole, it's easy to see why people fell in love with the epic scope of the world. While travelling the overworld, you will of course encounter random battles. Despite what you may think, the actual terrain you are walking in makes no difference to the enemy formation you encounter. The overworld's encounter tables work by splitting the world into an 8x8 grid, with each segment having its own selection of enemy formations. This causes a few tiles of early areas to actually have encounters from much later in the game. The most well known is the Peninsula of Power, a fan name for 4 tiles at the top of the southern continent that actually draw their encounter table from the northeast continent. If the player is ready for it, they can use this area to earn plenty of experience, and more importantly, gil early in the game. Gil that you get to spend in the towns. World A is populated with 9 towns, 10 if you include the Cardia Islands. In these towns you'll come across a variety of NPCs. The majority will just repeat one line, often a generic piece of encouragement, but others will drop hints as to where to look next, and some will even offer a bit more interaction if you bring certain items to them or have completed certain tasks. I'll talk more about the NPCs later on in the story section. For now, I'll note that they do help to make the world seem somewhat populated. You'll find many of the same services in most towns. The Sanctuary allows you to revive a fallen party member for a cost. Equipment can be bought from weapon and armour shops, with black magic and white magic having their own shops as well. A general goods shop will allow you to purchase various healing items for use in battle, and especially importantly in the pre-GBA versions, the sleeping bag, tent and cottage, also known as the house. These are important for the same reason as inns, the final building you'll find in most towns. Staying at an inn will cost you some gold, but doing so will restore your party to full health and replenish your magic, whether MP or charges. Pre-GBA, it is also one of the few ways to save the game, the other being those camping materials that you can buy in the general goods store. They can be used in the overworld and restore varying amounts of health, with the cottage also restoring magic charges. This is slightly bugged on the NES. The restoring of magic takes place after saving, so only applies if you elect to save, and if you load that save, you will need to restore your magic charges again. The fact that these items can only be used on the overworld is another aspect of the easiness of post-Dawn of Souls versions. These releases allow you to save almost anywhere, even within dungeons, While the decision was likely made as a concession to portability, it has almost as much impact on the difficulty as the changes to levelling. To find out why, we'd better take a closer look at the dungeons. All versions of the game feature 11 main story dungeons. Typically featuring between 3 and 5 floors, dungeons are a test of endurance, strategy and exploration. Monsters are unrelenting, safe areas do not exist, and some will even throw additional problems at you between random encounters. And in the case of most dungeons, sitting at the end waiting for you is a boss. Most dungeons are reasonably well designed, though they do tend to be rather sprawling with a large amount of wasted space. This sprawl is a factor in one of the more obnoxious elements. Exploration can be part of why people enjoy dungeons in RPGs. The problem is the amount of paths in these dungeons that offer zero payoff. The odd dead end is acceptable, but when you're exploring 8 quite long paths from one central spot, usually hitting 2 or more encounters on each path and then getting little to show for it, it does become grating. Another issue is fixed encounter tiles. Often found in treasure rooms, as the name suggests, these are individual tiles that guarantee an encounter when you step on them. Every time you step on them. Every time. Some of these encounters are difficult too, especially early in the game, and having to fight through one encounter, stepping forward to acquire treasure, then turning to leave and entering another encounter on the same tile can be an exercise in frustration. Some may find them to be excellent locations to farm experience and gold. Personally, I find them to be irritating more often than not, particularly when there are multiple close together. Having just one encounter per tile would have been fine. A point in the game's favour is the thematic variation. With enemy lists and visuals giving each dungeon its own unique feel, you never want to roll your eyes at yet another rocky tunnel. Obviously, this is more pronounced in later versions, with greater visual fidelity, but even the NES version manages to work within the limitations and make most dungeons distinct. You could probably tell which dungeon you were in even if you hadn't played the game in a while and loaded a save in the middle of a dungeon. Except you can't save in the dungeons on the NES. As I mentioned earlier, this has a big effect on difficulty. Being able to save in the middle of a dungeon on the later editions turns dungeons into something that more resembles a speed bump than a road-blocking endurance test. Imagine fighting through a dungeon for over an hour, only to lose to the boss. Wiping out in the story dungeons is a hard game over and a reload of the last save. If you're sensible and well practiced in the RPG formula, you save just before the boss where possible, so you only lose a few minutes if you wipe out. Without that option, any screw up can mean redoing the whole dungeon from the beginning. You won't even keep any items or experience gained the first time, it's just game over, hello load screen. It makes dungeons much more perilous, which you may or may not enjoy. When your time is in short supply, losing upwards of an hour for nothing can be rather galling. The bonus dungeons deserve a mention here. Exclusive to the GBA, PSP and iOS versions, the Soul of Chaos is a series of 4 extra dungeons. They are unlocked periodically throughout the game, but take note, going into them as soon as you have opened them is asking for a bad time. Tougher enemies may well be within your party's capabilities, but the bosses of these dungeons range from similar to the just pre-final bosses to considerably tougher than the final boss. The one benefit is that getting stomped by these bosses will return you to the dungeon entrance, rather than giving you a game over. This means any items you find within the dungeon remain yours. Useful considering many of the items are exclusive to these dungeons, and potentially more powerful than other items available to you. The PSP and iOS even have an additional super dungeon, the Labyrinth of Time. This dungeon has additional rules and is certain to give players a real challenge. The final boss of this dungeon has at least half again as much HP as the story's final boss, and much tougher defences. And that's the weakest of its 8 variants that can be encountered depending on your performance in the labyrinth. My opinion on the dungeons is probably clear. they are very much a product of the time, competent certainly, but lacking that polish that would only come once designers had fully experimented with the format and nailed down what works and what doesn't. Variation is good, and I don't recall feeling bored, annoyed at times with pathways to nowhere, but always engaged. So not a deal breaker, but not brilliant. That wraps up the where. Next we'll talk about the why. No analysis of a Final Fantasy game would be complete without discussing narrative elements. Given the focus of later entries on deep narratives and long cutscenes, the 13th title has around 7 hours of cutscenes alone, it may come as a surprise for me to say that story in the first Final Fantasy is very, very thin. This may largely be due to the limitations of the NES, and certainly compared to many other games of the time, it is leaps and bounds ahead, but part of this series is examining how well it holds up today, and to be truthful, there is very little here. I can't recall more than a dozen named characters, and most of those only have a single piece of dialogue, with maybe some extras if they take an item or provide access to something new. The backstory of the Warriors of Light extends as far as each having a crystal and having turned up at Cornelia. The villains similarly lack much in the way of development, falling into the realm of being evil for evil's sake for the most part. Quick spoiler warning, if it's even necessary, skip to the time shown if you do want to avoid the limited spoilers. The plot revolves around the Warriors of Light travelling the world using their small crystals to return the 4 large crystals to light. Each major crystal represents a classical force: earth, fire, water and air, and each is currently corrupted by one of the 4 fiends. While attempting not to spoil too much, once the crystals are restored, the warriors are then informed that the world is stuck in a stable time loop, and they must travel into the past and break the cycle. It sounds like a reasonable plot from that brief description. However, that brief description covers almost a quarter of the information that the game gives you, and most of that information comes in the form of 2 cutscene style lumps of scrolling text. To give the game its due, there is a decent amount of lore and world building. For example, you get to hear a few tidbits about the Luthernians and their airships before you get to meet the survivors of the race. If anything, the game presents a cohesive world with a rich history hidden beneath the surface more than it does a plot. There is one way to make the plot rise a couple of notches in my estimation, though it is a theory and is in no way canon. The end of the game states that upon breaking the time loop, the world is restored to how it should have been, effectively erasing the timeline the player interacted with. This meta-theory follows from this, and suggests that the game we played is actually the dreamlike memories of the warriors bleeding from the broken timeline into the fixed one. This helps explain why the plot is thin and characters aren't particularly well fleshed out. We aren't playing the actual events, just hazy memories of them. During the game, the story rarely leads you to your next destination, a bonus for those that dislike hand-holding and railroading in their games. However, I think the game is a little too hands-off. There are times when you don't have even a single clue as to where to go next, and just have to wander around, talking to everyone, hoping that they give you a rough idea of where to look next. I feel it misses the balance between guidance and player agency. The only thing left to mention on the story front is the various translations. Obviously, the NES has the roughest translation and the most limited presentation. By the PSP version, translation is much improved, though some lines retained their original translation due to the quasi-mimetic popularity of the lines. To surmise, if you're a narrative-focused player, there's just too little to go on here. Characters have next to no character, and through much of the game the plot feels like an excuse to shuffle the player from one dungeon to the next. Again, in its own time, it's a highlight, but in the modern era, Final Fantasy is poor in the story department. The final thing to talk about is the presentation. Graphics, sound and interface are all an important part of the experience and have all become elements that Final Fantasy as a series is known for. We'll start with the NES version, and I think you might be able to guess what I'm going to say. Yes, it is a product of its time. But for its time, it's visually impressive and the audio is top-notch. Most things are clear and identifiable, making the most out of the system's limited capabilities. The sound is obviously classic 8-bit sound chip, with only a couple of instruments at any one time, but the compositions are what sets the game apart. They are all distinct, with many of them being memorable, and some, such as the Prelude, are staples of Final Fantasy. While others have become so iconic that they are routinely referenced outside of the series. The downside, maybe even downfall, of the NES version, in my opinion, is the interfaces. The battle interface is frankly a mess, with large text boxes popping in and out of existence while sprites are moving up above. The jerking around of attention can get tiresome. It is also slow, painfully slow. Once multi-target spells are being thrown around, prepare for battles to take much longer, as the effect must be registered on each combatant individually. The other interfaces also fall short from a modern perspective. Individual inventories are unnecessary, and for each character to then have separate weapon and armour inventories that are so limited is even worse. It also makes shopping feel clunky, having to select the character that you are giving a certain item to without any initial feedback as to if they can actually use it. They're all fairly minor concerns, but they add up to frustrations, and it's clear why the interfaces were updated to more closely resemble the SNES entries for subsequent re-releases. On which note, we come to the Origins release. The updated graphics provide much more detail and give the world a far more vibrant feel. Full-screen backgrounds in battle are a solid addition that gives a more cohesive feeling compared to the mostly black with a slight nod to the terrain that the NES featured. I would guess this is mainly so that the game retains a similar scale to the NES, but I think going for a bit more detail would have been a sensible trade-off. The music has also gotten a big upgrade. With the CD quality available on the PS1, the soundtrack was completely redone to take advantage, keeping many of the melodies the same, but giving the tracks so much more depth. This version of the soundtrack is the best of the bunch. The interfaces were updated to fall more in line with modern systems. Battles no longer have text boxes popping in and out. The damage number and effect appear on the target, with spread magic occurring simultaneously. A single unified inventory reduces time wasted moving items around, while shops feel more a part of the world and give indications as to the item or spell's compatibility and effect. These all serve to prevent many of the frustrations and slowdowns that can occur with the original systems. The dash was also introduced, an optional feature that allowed you to move faster in towns and dungeons. With encounters being based on the number of steps taken, the dash has no effect on how many battles you face, but does make everything feel just a bit quicker. From here, things change only in minor ways. The GBA graphics are similar to the PS1, with in-battle sprites actually being comparatively larger, but overall the lower resolution does result in marginally reduced quality. The music also takes a hit with the GBA's notoriously poor sound reproduction. On the whole, it's not terrible, but the platform's limitations certainly make themselves known. For the PSP release, the graphics jumped again. With larger, more detailed sprites for pretty much everything, this is the best looking version of the game by far. With the CD quality PS1 soundtrack returning for the PSP release, music is as good as it's ever been here. In theory, the iOS and Android releases are identical when it comes to visuals. However, there are reports that newer smartphones may not look as good due to higher resolution screens but no update to the games, causing blurring. Audio quality has also been reduced to better suit the app format. Interfaces have been pretty much unchanged for the PSP version, while the iOS and Android versions get more touch-friendly interfaces. This again causes issues on larger tablets, with the touchscreen D-pad being a fixed proportion of the screen, growing bigger and harder to use on larger devices. Most menus have been reworked for the touch interface but remain functionally identical, while battles are pretty much the same except for one fairly ironic common complaint. Apparently, having to manually tap a target for your actions rather than hammering a button in easy fights can feel like time wasting. A complaint from the very first release returned in new form. So, after all of that, is Final Fantasy worth your time? It's a tough call that depends upon how much free time is available to you. To play through some version of where it all started is certainly a worthwhile experience, though the version you ought to play merits some discussion. The main story shouldn't take more than 15 hours in real time for a first time player on the later, easier releases. So if you're willing to risk that much time, I'd say go for it. If you need to be more selective, you can give this a miss. I will note that players who are much more focused on narrative elements may be left wanting a lot more. For those who are now sold on the game, which version is best? There's a couple of things to consider here, mainly ease of access and gameplay preference, i.e. magic system and difficulty. The NES version requires either a physical cartridge or an NES Classic Mini, both of which are hard to get a hold of. The magic system is also so bugged as to be barely half functional. I can only recommend the NES version to somebody who wants a purist experience. The PS1 version is the clear winner for those wanting the original challenge and magic system, but with functional spells and some interface improvements. I'd call the PS1 version almost the intended vision. Plus, Origins also includes Final Fantasy II. It is still available to download under the PS1 Classics label for the PS3, PSP and PS Vita. While technically only in some regions, there are workarounds that will allow you to download it from anywhere in the world. The GBA version's only selling point is that it also includes Final Fantasy II. Everything else it offers is matched or outclassed by the PSP edition. It slightly beats out the Android version if the bonus dungeons are an attraction for you. The PSP version has the most content, portability, a button interface, and is still available to download on both the PSP and the PS Vita, though you do have to jump through a couple of hoops with the closure of the inbuilt storefronts. It's the clear winner if the original magic system is not a selling point for you. The iOS version is the easiest to obtain if you have an Apple device. It is portable and has all the content, but the interface may not be to everyone's taste. Plus, the reported issues of blurry graphics should be kept in mind. The Android version has the same problems, less content and more bugs, so avoid it unless you're desperate, in which case cross your fingers and hope it works. There we have it. Final Fantasy. The epic series has its beginning, a foundation to build from. But how would it grow into what we see before us now? There's only one path open to us. We'll have to move down to the next item on the list. Originally released in 1988, but not seen outside of Japan until 2003, join me next time as I examine Final Fantasy II from the top.